Hello everyone, so let's continue chapter 4. So in the first part of this chapter we talked about the perfectly competitive market where we have the market dynamics would allow an equilibrium between the demand for workers and the supply of workers, and we will reach an equilibrium price or wages and an equilibrium quantity, which is the amount of people employed. Okay, assumptions are like we have an invisible hand. Market dynamics would ensure that we will go back to equilibrium and at any time we are away from that equilibrium. So now here we start to have some imperfections in the market or some examples of market interventions, and this is an intervention by the government where the government can impose payroll taxes or can offer subsidies. And we want to see how these two tools are going to affect our equilibrium labor market. So suppose that this payroll tax is imposed or assessed on employers. Okay, so now employers, they have to pay to the government a certain amount of taxes for each additional person employed. Okay, so definitely when they have to pay taxes now to each additional worker, that means the cost of production is going to increase. So their demand for the service of the worker is going to be affected. Okay, so it leads to a downward shift in the labor demand curve. Okay, so there would be a wedge or a gap between the amount that firms must pay to hire, which is the wage plus the tax, and the amount that workers actually receive. Okay, so they receive a certain amount, but actually the firms are paying another number because that number includes not only the wage but also the tax. So the tax increases the cost of employment and hence it reduces employment. Okay, so as the cost of hiring rises, the wage also received by workers is going to also decline because somehow the firm is going to try to pass this tax to workers. We will also discuss what we call the dead weight loss. Okay, so let's take the first case, which is a payroll tax imposed on firms. So the government is asking firms to pay taxes for each additional person employed. So looking at this graph, we have an initial equilibrium at point A where we have an intersection between the demand for workers and the supply of workers, and this is the dollars amount for the wage to be paid, and this is the amount of people working, okay, or employed. And we had an initial equilibrium point at W0 and then initial employment at E0. Now suppose that the government imposes a payroll tax of $1. So that means the cost of production is going to increase. Their demand for workers is going to decrease, leading to a shift in the demand curve from D0 to D1. So we have this drop in the demand, okay, from D0 to D1. So let me just show you, the entire graph. So looking at this graph, if they want to maintain the same number of people employed, right, then they have actually to reduce this wage all the way up to W0, which is the initial, minus 1 of how much they are paying to the government. So if they want to maintain the same amount of employment, then they would have to reduce the wages that much, right? But now what's going to actually happen is that the shift in the demand curve intersects with the supply curve at point B. So our new wage is actually W1. So there is a drop from the initial wage to the new wage, which is W1. So at W1, as the wage decreases, also the supply decreases. So the supply used to be at point A, which used to be here, where supply was equal to demand. Now, as the wage drops, also the supply of the service is gonna drop until we reach a certain equilibrium at point B. So, employment level is gonna also drop to E1, from E0 to E1, right? From the firm's point of view, they actually wish that they can pay W0 minus 1. They wish to be here, right? Where they can pass the tax 100% to workers. But actually, they cannot do that, right? Because they can lose workers. So what they're going to do is they're going to find kind of in-between solution. Not the initial one, not the what they wish, but actually something in between. So as the wage increases from what they actually wish to what is the equilibrium level, then also their demand for workers is going to drop until we reach the agreement point or the equilibrium point. At this equilibrium point, as I said, there is a drop in the wages and there is also a drop in the level of people employed. This is how much they are actually paying to workers, but this is how much they actually, or this is how much actually workers cost them. So it costs them to hire each additional worker, not just W1, but W1 plus the dollar, right? So the cost of hiring is this one, and how much they pay to workers is this one, which is W1. Right? So the payroll tax decreases the wage that workers receive, right, from W0 to W1, and increases, this is important, the cost of hiring workers from W0 to W1 plus 1. Now let's take another case in which the payroll tax is imposed on workers. So workers are the suppliers of the service, right? So let me just erase these. So they are the suppliers of the service. And okay, so again, and we have an initial equilibrium at point A, right? Now, as the government is asking now workers that they have to pay $1 for each additional income they get. Now, this is a discouragement to workers because each additional income I get, I would have to pay part of it to the government. So why should I work, right? So this is a disincentive to work. So if this is the initial equilibrium point, right, imposing a tax on workers means that the supply curve is going to shift towards the left. So it's going to shift kind of by the full amount, right? Like this is an imaginary point, W0 plus 1. If you want workers to keep working at E0, then they should be able to get the W0 plus an additional $1 so that they can make up for the tax they have to pay to the government. But this is not the case. This is what they wish to get if they want to maintain the initial level of employment, right? But actually, what they receive based on the reduction in service is going to be W1. So there is an increase in the wage rate as the supply of workers drop. There is an increase in the wage rate from W0 to W1. Okay? And at W1, this is how much they earn, right? But actually, this is what they earn, but what is left for them after they pay tax is this much. So this is what they get, and this is what they get after tax. This is the total income, and this is the net income. So they are supplying that amount of work, or this is the level of employment And looking at this level of employment, this is the wage rate in the market, but this is called the total wage rate. This is called the net wage rate. Okay? Next, let's talk about what's going to happen if we have a different shape of the supply curve. What if the supply curve is inelastic, or in this case, perfectly inelastic? So whatever wage you offer to the worker, they're gonna keep supplying the same amount of employment. This is what it means by inelastic. So they are kind of looking for a job, whatever wage you're gonna give it to them, they're gonna be happy and they're gonna take it, and they want to accept any wage. So this situation is perfect for the firm, because if there is a case where the government is asking firms to pay taxes, what they can do is just pass it 100% to workers. Okay? So if this is the initial equilibrium, having a perfectly competitive supply curve of workers, then a dollar increase in the tax shifts the demand curve from D0 to D1, and the wage rate that they have to pay falls completely from W0 to W0 minus 1. So they kind of pass it completely to workers, because their supply, the supply of workers, is perfectly inelastic. So let's pass it to them, because they will not respond, they will not reduce their employment, they keep working, so let's pass it 100% to them. The dead weight loss is shown in the graph on the right. So what we have here is this graph on the left. We already discussed it. We discussed the producer's surplus, which is this gray triangle. We discussed the worker's surplus, which is this Q triangle, right? Now let's talk about a tax. So whenever we have a tax, as we discussed in the previous graphs, there is a drop from E0 to E1. Employment drops. Also, we said that wage has now two types. I have a total wage, right? How much I get from the employer, but I also have a net wage, which is after tax. So looking at this rectangle, it looks like a square, which is this one, right? Looking at this square, so the insertion of this square in between the P and Q means a reduction in the producer's surplus. Compare this triangle P versus this triangle P. Compare this triangle Q versus this triangle Q. So the imposition of taxes, right, which is the difference between the total and the net tax, which would give me the dollar value of taxes, which is in this square, is going to mean shrinking of the producer's surplus and the worker's surplus, and it's actually a surplus going to the government. So we can kind of look at this as a producer's surplus, look at this as a government surplus, look at this as worker's surplus, and I'm left with something that is lost from the whole economy. So the triangle DL stands for dead weight loss, and this is a loss for the whole economy because it used to be included, right? It used to be included in surpluses, whether it's a producer or whether it's a worker. Now it's gone. Nobody is taking this DL. It's gone. It disappeared from the surplus, right? So if I'm talking, I'm sorry for the mess. So if I'm talking about the surplus for the whole economy, right? If I'm talking about the surplus for the whole economy in the triangle on the left versus the triangle on the right, then just by looking, right? By looking your eyes, this is big triangle is the surplus for the whole economy. This big triangle. Here, it's not a triangle anymore because it's losing the peak part, right? The top part. It's losing the top part. So this is a surplus to the including everything, producer, worker, the government. Here we don't have the government yet, so producer and worker. But this part is lost, and that's why we call it the dead weight loss. All right, so I'm gonna stop here and continue in the next